A Russian general assassinated by Ukraine in Moscow. Kyiv accused him of using chemical weapons on the battlefield. That's as Russian forces are gaining more ground, and the US President-in-waiting, Donald Trump, is calling for the war to end. So can that happen? This is Inside Story. Hello again, I'm James Bays. Far from the battlefields of Ukraine, a Russian general has become one of the war's latest victims, killed by a bomb blast in central Moscow along with his assistant. Hidden in a scooter, the device exploded in a sophisticated Ukrainian operation. Lieutenant General Igor Kirillov was chief of Russia's nuclear, biological and chemical defense forces, accused of ordering chemical weapons attacks on Ukrainian troops. On the battlefield, Ukraine's been struggling, losing ground to Russian forces helped by North Korean soldiers. All this weeks before Donald Trump returns as US president, saying he wants to end the war. So how much is the return of Trump influencing Russian and Ukrainian tactics now? What are the chances he'll end the war? And if so, how? And what might happen if Russia decides to press on against a weakening Ukrainian army? We'll discuss all of this in a moment with our guests, but first this report from Hamza Mohammed.
A Russian general killed in central Moscow, far from the battlefields in Ukraine. Ukraine says Igor Kirillov was a legitimate target who ordered the use of chemical weapons against Ukrainian soldiers. Moscow described the killing as a terrorist attack.
The permanent mission of Russia to the UN will raise the issue of the committed terrorist act during the UN Security Council meeting on the supply of Western weapons to Ukraine, requested by Russia on December the 20th. We are confident that all the organisers and perpetrators of the murder of Igor Kirillov will be found and punished.
Ukrainian government sources have confirmed their intelligence service organised the assassination. As it was carried out, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy, who had been meeting EU leaders and senior officials, called for a show of unity against Russia.
We need a strong common position of all partners, and we need real peace. The most important thing is that this is the kind of peace that can be achieved through strength.
As Russian forces make advances on the battlefield in eastern Ukraine, some experts say the attack was aimed at winning more leverage with the United States before Donald Trump returns as president.
Because of the battlefield setbacks, Ukraine has a very hard time and a very short window of opportunity. Therefore, it will use all means at its disposal in order to undermine somehow Russia's ability to wage this war and to position itself in a better way when it comes to negotiations when Donald Trump enters the Oval Office.
Trump has vowed to push for a ceasefire between the warring sides when he takes office in January, but has not provided details. That has sparked fears in Kyiv and Europe that Ukraine could be pushed into making concessions to Moscow.
We'll be talking to President Putin, and we'll be talking to the representatives, Zelenskyy and representatives from Ukraine. We got to stop it. It's carnage.
Russia occupies nearly 20% of Ukrainian territory that it says it will keep. All sides are waiting to see what Trump will do and whether he can succeed in getting a ceasefire agreed. Hamza Mohammed, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Well, let's discuss this more with today's guests. In Washington, D.C., we have Anatol Lieven, who's director of the Eurasia program at the Quincy Institute and a member of the Valdai Club, a Russian think tank. In Moscow, Pavel Felgenhauer, he's an independent defense and military analyst. And in Kyiv, Oleksiy Melnyk is co-director of the Razukov Centre, a Ukrainian public policy research institute. Thank you, all of you, for joining us. Let me start with you, Anatol. This seems to have been a particularly audacious attack, and it seemed to have very sophisticated planning and execution.
Yes, indeed. It's not the first attack organised by the Ukrainians, assassination within Russia, but it's certainly by far the highest profile one. Yes, it does indicate Ukraine's ability to strike Russian targets.
Pavel, tell us how this is being viewed in Moscow and what they're saying about how this took place, because it was detonated, we said an electric scooter, just as the general and his assistant were leaving the building, I think just after 6 a.m. in the morning. To set it off at that exact moment required precision and some sort of visual surveillance.
Well, yes, there was visual surveillance, but the attack was made possible because General Igor Kirillov didn't have any security detail whatsoever. He simply didn't have it. And of course, abandoned electric scooter is normal in Moscow at most times, but not right now because Moscow is covered with ice and snow, and all the scooters were removed by the companies who leased them. So if there would be at least some kind of detail, they would notice that the scooter lying around in December Moscow is not right. So it was just simply not, he was not guarded. He was not considered a serious target. And that allowed the Ukrainians to do that rather easily. There was, of course, a person who was with the bomb there. He was monitoring the building, and when the general appeared, he just simply detonated through a mobile phone, and that was it. But he was soon, apparently, the Russians found out, and Moscow has a very sophisticated system of close television cameras securing all the Moscow streets, and equipped with a computerized system of recognition of faces. So the Russian authorities swiftly found out who that was, where he went, and found him trying to hide in some kind of village outside of Moscow. So it was very swiftly and effectively figured out the whole scheme.
Let me just pick you up on something you said there, Pavel. But you say he had no security detail, and yet this was a person with a very important job in the military hierarchy, and he was a very prominent and outspoken figure. Is this considered there as a major security failing?
Well, most likely that will be, though the Kremlin right now is promoting that it was that the Russian security services very swiftly cracked the case. But yes, that's a failure, of course, not to see that this could be a security threat to this particular general. The troops that he's commander of are also in charge in the battlefields of Ukraine for the usage of heavy flame-throwing equipment, the TOS systems of Buratina and Solntsepyok, which are very much used. These are unguided missiles with fuel bomb warheads that are very much used to break through the Ukrainian diggings and defenses. So these are troops that are very much involved in the Russian slow but steady advance in Ukraine. So they should have actually given him some kind of detail.
Oleksiy, I'm interested by the fact, although officially Ukraine has said nothing about this, numerous media have been speaking to sources in the Ukrainian security service, the SBU, and they are saying they did it. Normally, there's sort of plausible deniability about these things, but they seem to be advertising that they did it this time.
I think it's quite common for many security services, for instance, Israel. Ukrainian security service or Ukrainian officials this time, as usually, didn't deny their responsibility, but also haven't claimed the responsibility behind the attack. But obviously, this targeted killing was done in a very professional manner. Again, from the point of view of the highest-ranking Russian general, with no civilian casualties, and I assume that the guy who was captured by the Russian FSB of Uzbek nationality Most probably he is just appointed as a victim. I'm quite sure that Russians would have hard time to find the real actors behind this act of sabotage.
Pavel, just tell me a little bit more about this general, General Igor Kirillov, 54 years old. His job, chief of the radiation, chemical and biological defence troops. But I think it's also worth remarking on the fact that he was quite irregular on Russian television, quite a pro-Kremlin voice with quite outspoken views.
Yes, he appeared a lot speaking to journalists and in briefings in the defense ministry, telling us about the American laboratories, biological laboratories in Ukraine and other former post-Soviet nations, saying this has been a story that many Russian officials have been promoting, that these are biological war orientated laboratories, which has been denied, of course, by Washington and by other Soviet states. So yes, he has been telling about bad American activity, but I don't think that that was actually really the intention of the attack on him. What he said to journalists. I believe just that he was a prominent general and he didn't have a security detail. So he was an easy target, and the Ukrainian apparently took the opportunity to hit an easy target.
Anatol, you're there in Washington, D.C. How do you think this will be seen in the US and by the West? Because Russia's claiming this was a terrorist act. They're planning to raise it at the UN Security Council. Yes, he was a military man, but he was on Russian soil and he was not targeted in a battlefield environment. Do you think some in the West will be a little uneasy about Ukraine's tactics here?
Well, not from a legal point of view, I think, because after all, it is Russia that is waging war within Ukraine. The big question is how the incoming Trump administration will view this kind of thing from a political point of view, because, of course, they are, or at least Trump himself and Vice President Vance, appear anxious for an early peace settlement if they can get it. And so the question that they will be addressing will be how this affects the chances of a peace settlement, how the Russians will respond, whether this will lead to a new mutual escalation that will impede peace talks. And we don't know that yet. I mean, clearly from a Ukrainian point of view, this is an attempt to rattle the Russian establishment, to tell them that they are not safe, even within Moscow. But we now have to see what Russia does in response. One can imagine that the response will be to try to target figures in Kyiv.
Oleksiy, you heard Anatol there to say that he thinks it's Ukraine trying to rattle the Russian establishment. What's your view of the message that Ukraine was trying to send with this particular attack?
I agree with Anatoly that one of the target audience is the Russian military and political establishment, to show them that they are not safe anymore. And another key audience is the Russian public, because Putin, from the very beginning of this war, is trying to persuade the Russians that this is a so-called special military operation, and Moscow lives like nothing is going on there. And there have been a number of drone attacks on Moscow, and I think that this particular case actually shows not just the Russian public in general, but many Russian high-ranking officials that if they are not taking the responsibility to the international criminal court in a legal way, then Ukrainians will try to establish justice in their own way, no matter This is the war, and it's not a terrorism in the classical sense. Again, I also agree that I don't know how carefully Ukrainian leadership considered possible reaction from Washington, D.C., because been a number of cases when our main partners try to persuade Ukraine not to do this or that. For instance, during Prigozhin's rebellion last year, or Ukrainian attacks on Russian nuclear facilities or Russian refineries, oil storages. So I think that this is one of the factors that Ukraine should consider very carefully while planning such attacks.
Pavel, how is this being perceived by ordinary people in Russia? Because the war, perhaps in Ukraine, can feel a long way away, but we have had drone strikes, we have had previous assassinations and bombing. Does it begin to feel that that war that's a long way away is coming to Moscow?
Moscow is basically a city that's removed from the war. It's not felt here much at all in the streets and in the cafes and restaurants and concert halls. This attack of course, will cause a bit of concern, but one attack is not enough, and 2 people dead is not enough really to change the overall mood of the Moscow population, I believe. Something more dramatic happened for that to really sink in, that the Moscow can become a frontline city. Right now, it's not a frontline city at all.
Anatol, let's quickly examine the claims of chemical weapons use in Ukraine that this general was in charge of, if they are true. What do you make of some of these claims that more than 2,000 Ukrainian service members have been treated in hospital, that they've been using a chemical weapon called chloropicrin, which was first used in World War I, a toxic agent? What do you make of those claims?
Well, the status of this chemical is rather ambiguous. It's not a lethal agent, as was used in Syria. It's an ingredient in other things, including completely legal uses of pesticides and forms of riot control gas. The question is the quantity. But Russia has been using it, it seems, not to kill people, but to, as riot police use it to disable them, and above all to force Ukrainians out of bunkers. And it's therefore not, this is not a weapon of mass destruction. But as I say, its exact legal status is something that the lawyers would have to debate.
Oleksiy, let's look at the context of all this and where we are now. The 3rd anniversary on the war will be, if the war's still going, on February the 24th. So we're approaching that 3rd anniversary. It's a war of attrition with huge human costs. But it's a war too, is it not, that your country, Ukraine, is slowly losing? What's your assessment as a former military man and defence official? It's going badly, is it not?
Yes, indeed. There is a very little success, to put it softly, on the battlefield. The Ukrainian forces, Ukrainians are forced to withdraw from certain positions, but at the same time, there is no significant progress on the Russian side. Yes, Russia is making tactical advances on a daily basis, but Russia pays enormous price for these tactical advances. It's roughly 5 casualties per square kilometer. And the tempo of Russian advance is something like 30 kilometers per month. So it will take Russia even, to capture the Donetsk Oblast. It will take probably 1 year or more. The Russian forces were not able to convert their tactical successes into operational breakthrough. But anyway, as I said, there is very little optimism about Ukrainian possibilities to conduct another counteroffensive operation. Yes, it's been a war of attrition, but this is a war of attrition for both sides. And the question is which side will be able to fight longer, because we talk about weaponry, we talk about economic resources, where Ukraine can count on Western support. But when it comes to manpower, Russia definitely has at least 3 times bigger mobilization resource. And now it seems like the only way to end this bloodshed is to find some level of compromise and sit and talk at the negotiation table.
Pavel, do you share that assessment of the situation? And can Russia, it may be gaining ground, can it continue to bear these huge human costs? I mean, one estimate I have, a US estimate, admittedly, is 600,000 dead and wounded since the start of the war. And Russia now, certainly in one area, in Kursk, having to rely on North Korean forces who are also taking large casualties.
Well, apparently the North Koreans have been deployed in relatively small numbers to test their capability to get cooperate with the Russian troops on the battlefield. And their entire numbers that are not yet deployed will be about 10,000, which is not that really big compared to the size of the Russian army fighting on the front line. So I don't think that factor would be decisive. There's hope that expressed by the Russian President Vladimir Putin that these losses and slow Russian advance will break the morale of the Ukrainian troops and that Ukraine will collapse or at least agree to Russian terms. And there is some hope that maybe the new American administration will help that happen, and that there's going to be a compromise, but a compromise on what Russia believes its terms, a Russian favorable compromise to end this conflict.
Anatol, would you agree with that? I mean, we obviously this has been going on for nearly 3 years, but the timeline right now, arguably, is just a month. That's when Donald Trump is in the White House. That's when things could change when he takes office.
Well, yes, but I mean, I don't think that the Trump administration is simply going to give up and agree to Russian terms. There will be negotiations and there will be compromise. Both sides will have to give up their maximal positions. And of course, on the Russian side, it will be determined to a great extent by what Russia thinks its chances are on the battlefield. I mean, if, as my colleagues have said, the Russian government thinks that this is going to be a war of attrition going on and on and on, with enormous losses for very small gains, then they will be inclined to compromise. But if they think, or if there is a complete Ukrainian collapse, then of course they will want to go for much more. And that's something that we really cannot easily judge, because there is the analogy of the First World War, where there was attrition for years and years, and then one side or the other did collapse. Part of the problem is, Pavel can speak to that much more than I do, that we're getting a lot of word from Western journalists from the Ukrainian side about the exhaustion of Ukrainian troops. But of course, we're not getting that word from the Russian side. So we have a much less clear idea of what the condition of the Russian armed forces in the front line is.
Oleksiy, President Zelenskyy said originally he wanted to regain all the territory. Now he seems to be floating a new position that he might be prepared to freeze things if there are guarantees given to the western half of Ukraine, what he currently controls, maybe even making it a NATO member, a sort of what some are saying, a West Germany, East Germany solution?
Yes, indeed. We observed, if not radical, but some changes in Ukraine's official, very maximalistic position that President Zelenskyy announced even a few months ago. Now he's talking about possible compromises, but there are still some real red lines for President Zelenskyy. And these red lines, or the level of compromise, should be carefully considered against what Ukrainian society is ready to accept. NATO membership is one of the priorities, but it can be either adjusted or postponed. It's a big deal, but not something that Ukrainians will go on the street and protest.
Okay, I'd like to bring in Pavel just to respond to that. Pavel, do you see any mood from the Moscow side, from President Putin, for compromise right now?
Well, right now the official line is not that Russia should achieve all its objectives, and the objective is to the 4 provinces should be accepted as Russian territory, including also Crimea, and NATO membership should be totally closed and forever for Ukraine, and so on. But again, what happens on the battlefield in the coming months will determine which side goes. I mean, to freeze a war that's getting nowhere right now, really, seems a good idea. But again, even if that is theoretically, politically agreed, actually hammering out ceasefire with the demilitarized zone, like in Korea or somewhere in Cyprus, well, that will require so much actual groundwork for diplomats, deploying some kind of peacekeepers. I mean, right now that all seems rather remote, because simply declaring a ceasefire where where forces stand right now on the ground, that won't work at all. You have to work out some kind of demilitarized zone thing, and that will also require a lot of negotiations, a lot of time. And while that's happening, the fighting is going to continue. So I don't see much prospect, even if there is a desire on both sides to find a compromise, to actually swiftly work out a compromise.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all our guests today, Oleksiy Melnyk, Pavel Felgenhauer and Anatol Lieven. If you joined us partway through our discussion, remember you can always watch the programme again whenever you want on our website at aljazeera.com. Where shall we cast the Inside Story spotlight next time? Please send us your comments and suggestions. Find us on Facebook, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or on X, we are at AJ Inside Story. From me, James Bays, I'll see you back here very soon. And from all the team here, please stay safe. Bye-bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.